Once Upon a Midlife, Revisited. Long ago in my youth, I spent a year traveling with a group called Up With People, which uses a musical performance as the vehicle for intercultural education. And one night, somewhere in the wilds of Michigan, we were singing our way through what was by then a very familiar 1960s medley. And as we finished singing, Blowin' in the Wind, and took a breath to launch into Michael, Row Your Boat Ashore, the music stopped. And there we were, frozen, unable to move, realizing that all eyes were on us, and the entire audience was holding their breath. Those three familiar notes that every night led us into that next familiar number didn't happen. It's kind of how I see midlife. Suddenly, the music that we've been humming along to stops, and we're suspended in one of those moments of transition, holding our breath and wondering what will happen next. So what stops the music? Doing battle with one of those dragons called cancer that sweeps in and starts chomping on someone near and dear? Launching our children or burying our parents? Realizing that the goals of our youth have damaged the planet and struggling to rein in the story of unlimited resources? Some days, I really long for the chirpy little voice of our stage manager who popped out from behind the curtain that night in Michigan and said, "As you can see, we're experiencing some technical difficulties. You can all breathe now, and we'll get the show started again in just a moment." Last month, some of our 30-somethings shared their perspectives on that transition from being young adults to being real adults. 18 years ago, at about that same transition point, I gave a sermon called Once Upon a Midlife, based on the book by Alan Cheenan, which is a collection of classic stories and mythic tales to illuminate the middle years. I suppose that I was looking for guidance as I entered that period of life when happily ever after ends with a question mark rather than a period. In her book, New Passages, Gail Sheehy defines it this way: midlife is the metaphysical point where we recognize the end of unlimited promise and the fact that we cannot control many of the bad things that happen to us. In a de-illusioning period, we incorporate those truths, which can weigh us down and make us feel prematurely old during the period of transition. Midlife is that de-illusioning period when we recognize the end of unlimited promise and the fact that we cannot control many of the bad things that happen to us. I guess by that definition, I still fall into the midlife category. Cheenan's collection of fairy tales and his second book, In the Ever After, focus on stories for the second half of life, when the prince goes bald and the princess experiences her midlife crisis. I wrote that sermon at a point in time in my life when I was still childless. Cancer had just claimed the first of my friends, and my husband had just quit his university job to follow his passion of timber framing, at least for a while. It was definitely a time when firm answers were blowing in the wind. 35, 45, 55. Midlife really isn't about the numbers. And for those few of you today who aren't old enough to have noticed. Middle age gets older the closer you get to whatever age you thought that was. In reality, I'm probably now much closer to the end of the third quarter. And I'm starting to look for guidance on how to navigate the waters of older age. This whole period of life is a relatively new phenomenon. In 1776, the average life expectancy was 35. Gail Sheehy's book, New Passages, looks at the shifts that have happened in the period of my lifetime. Adolescence now starts earlier and often lasts until around 30. Anyway, the period of marriage and family comes years later than it used to, and I can attest to it being a very different story starting at 40 than when my parents started at 20 in their lives. What Sheehy calls the golden years are now supposed to be from 70 to, say, 84-ish. Many of us actually have a whole second lifetime of time that previous generations haven't had. And we're still in the process of figuring out what that means. I think we need to revisit stories passed down through the ages that provide insight for addressing the challenges of those middle and elder years. Chinan's research into the realm of cross-cultural fairy tales found in the 5,000 or so of them that he reviewed, about 10% that have protagonists who are middle-aged, and another 2 to 5% of those stories are about being old. So we may have to pay attention to find them amongst the barrage of stories of younger wives and Miatas and facelifts and red hair dye that our culture throws at us. The middle tales have protagonists who are neither young nor old. They're married, earn a living, they grapple with personal failure, marital conflict, and tragedy. Many of the middle tales describe role reversals, women learning to assert themselves and becoming king, and about men falling from the white horse of save-the-day heroism and learning about vulnerability, limitation, and relatedness with these role reversals, leading toward integration and balance. Some of the stories model how humor can show us a way through when the responsibilities of midlife prohibit fighting or fleeing. And others are about losing everything and starting again. The elder tales tell us of transforming everyday inner life, of letting go, of sowing seeds for the next generation rather than scaling mountaintops. They have us making friends with our former enemies or with Mr. Death. They remind us to return home to find the treasure that has always been there, right there in our own backyard. I want to share one of those stories with you. The cracked pot. An elderly man in India, or an elderly Chinese woman, the story is the same. They each had 2 large pots, and each pot hung on the ends of a pole, which they carried across their shoulders. And each day, they used this device to carry water to their home. One of the pots was perfect and always delivered a full portion of water. And the other, it had a deep crack and it leaked. At the end of the long walk from the stream to the house, the cracked pot arrived only half full. For a full 2 years, this situation occurred daily, with the man or the woman bringing home only 1.5 pots full of water. And of course, the perfect pot was proud of its accomplishments, but the poor cracked pot was ashamed of its own imperfection and miserable that it could only do half of what it had been made to do. After 2 years of what that pot perceived to be bitter failure, the cracked pot spoke to the woman or the man one day, saying, "I'm ashamed of myself because this crack in my side causes the water to leak out all the way back to your house." And the older person smiled and said, "But did you notice that there are flowers on your side of the path, but not on the other pot side? I have always known about your flaw, so I planted flower seeds on your side of the path. And every day while we walked back home, you watered them and you made them grow. For 2 years, I have been able to pick these beautiful flowers to decorate the table and give to my friends and my neighbors. Without you being just the way you are, there would not have been this special beauty to grace our homes or to grace our lives." This story does the opposite of giving us permission to become crackpots in our old age. It reframes our brokenness and our imperfections and encourages us to use them to nurture the beauty in the world. Shifting back to Sheehy's theme of coming to terms with the things we don't have control over. This week, the niece of one of my coworkers was beaten to death by her on-again, off-again boyfriend. Last week, a wildfire burned the fields up to the back door of my parents' best friend's home. The land of my earliest memories is black. Cancer and other nasty diagnoses have descended into the lives of way too many of my friends. And I won't go into the political situation. How do we come to terms with all of that? In Heather Forrest's book called Wisdom Tales from Around the World, she retells a Zen story from Japan called The Wild Strawberry. A man was running and stumbling and gasping for breath as a ferocious tiger chased him. And dashing for the edge of the cliff, he saw a vine. And in one last bold leap, he grabbed it and swung himself over the cliff's edge. He felt a moment of relief as that tiger up there took a big swipe but couldn't reach him. And then the man looked down. And there was another tiger down there. Tightening his hold on the vine, the man wondered, "What do I do? What do I do?" And then, to his dismay, he looks up and he sees two little mice. One dark as night and the other light as day, nibbling at his vine. And he knew it was only a matter of time before he would fall into the jaws of the tiger below. And just then, he noticed a wild strawberry, and he reached out and picked it. And never has a strawberry tasted so sweet. At some level, I think we're all aware of the tiger's jaws. Each day as we grow older, we hold on to that vine. And I wish each of you a wild strawberry, each and every day. Please join me in singing